So, good evening, everybody. On Monday, we discussed emotions, and today we will talk about melancholy. But before we start, I would like to say some words about the exam. If somebody wants to make an exam, of course you can write it in German or in English. We will have this exam, as you know, in 2 weeks. On the 25th of January at 5 o'clock here in the same room, and the second possibility will be on the 1st of March, also at 5 o'clock, but not here, but in the Vordere Zolllandstraße, in the 4th floor, in the room 20. Of course, I realize that this lecture is a very difficult lecture. So the exam will be very easy. I will not ask you any details. The main point for me is that you understand the principal approach to art history from this point of view of representation. So I give you an example, because I will not ask you anything about emotions, because it was an exceptional day. It would be, the possible question would be, how can emotion be represented in art? And what is a special approach of the theory of representation if you want to analyze emotions in art in comparison to other approaches? So that's about the, that you see, you know, how this exam will take place. So it will be, I'm only interested in whether you really understood, you know, the main points. I won't ask you any kind of details. You have any questions about this? No, okay. So let's start with our lecture on melancholy. Who hasn't experienced it? Melancholy, moods of depression, the feeling of simply having fallen out, the paralyzing absence of all desire, the total void. I find it intriguing to take a feeling, an emotional state that we generally consider to be very personal, very private, and to try to look at it in a larger historical and cultural context. It's instructive to see how melancholy is variously experienced, to see how it has been understood conceptually and assessed, to see the context in which it occurs, to ask whether it is to be interpreted as being induced by outer stimuli, or rather as being a purely inner subjective experience, a condition of the soul, a question of temperament, simply a part of human life. Or is it perhaps a form of madness, an illness? How do we see the relationship between the physic and the psyche? Over the course of history, melancholy has been viewed from shifting perspectives. From antiquity to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, up to the modern era and the present day. However, the shifts in perspective have not been determined exclusively by historical circumstances. Different disciplines have different ways of looking at things. The perspective that I, for example, have on melancholy changes according to whether I consider it from the viewpoint of theology, philosophy, medicine, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, sociology, or art. Each historical period has its leading science. In antiquity it was philosophy, which by reason of its adherence to the humorous theory was very closely linked to medicine. In the Middle Ages it was theology. In the modern era it has been the natural sciences, and today in particular neurobiology. This does not mean, however, that for each period there have not been parallel forms of discourse. In the Middle Ages, alongside theology, the medical conception that the ancients had of the human being continued to hold sway. In the Renaissance, Christian conceptions intertwined with others that dated from antiquity. Today, psychoanalysis and the cultural sciences adopt points of view that are at variance with pure neuroscience. So, what is melancholy? How is it brought about? How can it be confronted and cured? How do the physic and the psyche interrelate? Today still, we are far from having found clear answers to all these questions. But first, let me say a few words about the etymology of the word melancholy and about how the term relates to the term depression. The word melancholy ultimately comes from Greek melas, which means black, and chole, which means bile. This is Galle in German. Melancholy is thus a state or condition characterized by a predominance of black bile. Allow me briefly to explain this notion, which derives from the ancient theory of the four bodily fluids, or humors. Up until the 20th century, one spoke only of melancholy. It was only when the phenomenon began to be viewed as a medical issue that the notion of depression was introduced. We typically ask what the difference is between melancholy and depression. It would make more sense to ask how the terms melancholy and depression are understood in specific times in history and in specific forms of discourse. If we look up the German word Melancholie in Wikipedia, we read the following, translated into English. Melancholy, from the Greek melancholia via Latin melancholia, meaning a condition characterized by the predominance of black bile, also referred to as gloom or dejectedness, a term denoting a disposition marked by depression, mental or emotional pain, sadness or meditativeness, a disposition that cannot usually be attributed to a specific cause or circumstance. In the 20th century, whenever a reference was being made to a psychic disposition or disorder, the term melancholy was largely replaced by the term depression. End of quote. In his essay Trauer and Melancholie, Mourning and Melancholia, written in 1915, an essay that is well worth reading, Sigmund Freud still speaks of melancholy and not of depression. Here, Freud makes a very clear distinction between mourning and melancholy. I quote Freud, "In mourning, it is a world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself." End of quote. In mourning, the loss, the death of a loved person or the loss of some abstraction or ideal is consciously perceived. With melancholy, however, this is not the case. Both phenomena share many features: a profound, painful sense of ill-being, the cessation of interest in the outside world, the loss of the capacity to love, the inhibition of any kind of activity. But unlike mourning, melancholy is connected with a lowering of self-esteem. It's enlightening to observe in what periods melancholy is most actively discussed. During the 1970s and 80s, for example, hardly anyone gave the notion much thought. But in the 1990s, melancholy increasingly became a subject of debate. A whole slew of publications, including new editions of previously published works, began to attract attention. For example, I can point out the many new editions of published works dealing with melancholy, such as Robert Burton's classic, The Anatomie of Melancholy, first published in 1621, republished in 1991 in a new German translation. Or the German translation of the seminal work by Raymond Klibansky, Erwin Panofsky and Fritz Saxl, originally entitled Saturn and Melancholy, Studies in the History of Natural Philosophy, Religion and Art. The English edition was first published in 1964, the German edition again in 1992. You can't imagine how many books and conferences were held after 1990 about melancholy. I will not read it all to you. You can find part of it, the most important you will find in the list of literature. Now, what were the reasons for this renewed interest in the subject? I think the loss of utopia and the belief in progress, the lack of perspective, all resulting from a series of causes, namely the collapse of the socialist states, the disappointment concerning the salubrious effects of technical progress or of the development of productive forces. As a corollary to that disappointment, the awareness of the ecological disaster that has come about, the increase in violence and in the frequency of war, an increase that has reached an unprecedented level in our so-called civilized world. Directly connected to this, a frequently held opinion that the project called enlightenment has been a failure. That disillusionment with the notion of our being rational subjects governed by our volition. The deepening realization of the complexity and interconnectedness of power structures and the resulting awareness of the difficulty of breaking up and altering those structures. The realization of how relative the value of our acquired knowledge is, and how little man's insights and knowledge have contributed and continue to contribute to humanizing our world. So, considering the general state of affairs in the world today, it seems perfectly appropriate that melancholy should become a subject of interest. Discourse regarding the notion of melancholy dates back to ancient Greece. Around the year 420 BC, the Greek physician Hippocrates wrote a treatise in which he described the fluids of the human body, thereby laying the foundation of the humoral theory, a theory that was held to be valid throughout the Middle Ages and well into the modern era. In the 2nd century of the post-Christian era, Galen elaborated on this theory, taking account of the writings of numerous physicians such as Rufus of Ephesus, among others. What I show you is a woodcut of the Middle Ages, but where you can see that this theory goes on and still is of importance. According to this theory, the human being, and this means a person's mental state, physical condition and health, are determined by 4 bodily fluids, namely blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, gelbe und schwarze Galle. The organ identified with black bile is the spleen, and the parts of the body most affected by the fluid are the heart, the head, and the stomach. When all 4 fluids are in a state of perfect balance, harmony and good health result. The fluids determine a person's temperament. According to whether there is a predominance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile or black bile in a person's constitution, the person will have a sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric or melancholy temperament. As always in antiquity, what mattered was the right balance. But it was not only a question of balance. It was also a question of temperature and degree of moisture. An excess of black bile, accompanied by low temperature and dryness, gives rise to melancholy in the form of gloominess. When accompanied by moisture and heat, however, the same excess can lead to manic states. Melancholy can determine a person's temperament, that is, a person's fundamental tendency to be melancholy. But it can also occur temporarily as a passing mood. In serious cases, it can also lead to a disorder, to states of delusion. I find it remarkable that the ancients were already able to recognize the complexity of the phenomenon of melancholy, the unity of body and psyche, the spectrum ranging from fundamental disposition to passing mood, and from passing mood to manifest disorder. Also insights they provided regarding the connection between mania and depression. At this particular juncture, I would like to stress the importance of thinking in structured terms. That is, the importance of seeing that the concept that the ancients had of melancholy comes very close to the conception we have of it today, even though we have abandoned the theory of the 4 humors. Research is done to try to identify the causes. Various forms of therapy are recommended. So the ancients are also writing about the therapy which is recommended, such as taking walks in fresh air, music, travel, diets, bright interiors. In conversation, one is supposed to give melancholy persons the opportunity to contradict what is being said and to prevail in order to bolster their self-confidence. Christian theology moralized melancholy. Melancholy is related to sloth, accidia, and is therefore condemned as being sinful. Melancholy has also been understood in the Protestant faith as well as temptation by the devil. A true believer in God must be able to overcome melancholy. By contrast, medieval medicine continued the tradition of antiquity, mostly relying on the intermediary of Arabic sources. The humorism of late antiquity established the basis of medieval medicine with its concept of the connection between the body and the psyche, its interest in the stars and the cosmos, and at the same time its moral conceptions and analogies. Melancholy was associated with the element earth, with autumn, with evening, and with old age. On the other hand, we find in medieval poetry a lyrical expression of melancholy. This is altogether not judgmental. Namely, a 13th century poem by Walter van der Vogelweide, which was also illustrated somewhat later between 1300 and 1320 in the so-called Codex Manesse. The poem, which is in Middle High German, begins with the verses. I cited and then I translated. Ich saß auf einem Steine und dachte Bein mit Beine, darauf saß ich den Ellenbogen. Ich hätte in meine Hand gesmogen das Kinne und ein min Wange. Da dachte ich mir viel ange, wie man zur Welt sollte leben. Which translate into English as, I sat upon a rock and crossed one leg over the other, whereupon I placed my elbow, nesting my chin and my cheek in my hand. There I pondered at length over how one should live in this world. Quote, end of quote. Since antiquity, the image associated with melancholy was supposed with a head resting on a hand. There was also another completely different tradition, which was important when it came to understanding melancholy, namely astrology. So astrology is very, very complex, very difficult. I can't go into this into detail. If you are interested, read the book of Klibansky, Panofsky, Saxl, and the book of Dieter Blume, which you find in my literature list. Astrological knowledge first emerged in Babylon, and from there it made its way to Greece, where during the Hellenistic period in particular, it played a significant role. In early Christianity, astrology was suppressed, as heaven belonged to God and not to the pagan gods. From the 12th century on, this wisdom was revived thanks to Arabic sources, which were translated into Latin. Astrology saw melancholy as being caused by the planet Saturn. The planet Saturn had fused with the Roman agricultural deity Saturnus, and also with the Greek god Kronos. A very contradictory god, mostly seen as a malevolent and ominous. But at the same time, Saturn was seen as a planet of the spirit. Germany saw the development of Planetenkinderbilder, that is, the children of the planets, images that were then made enormously popular thanks to printing. I show you these medieval manuscripts, or later I show you the engraving by Martin van Heemskerk. And you see here the children of Saturn, and you see that it includes land cultivation, misfortune, prisoners, people who have been executed, the sick. But it's not really a personification of melancholy, but you see on the left side, you see people who made suicide. So of course the reason for that was melancholy. In the Italian Renaissance, the notion of melancholy acquired a fundamentally new meaning. Marsilio Ficino, one of the most significant Florentine Platonic Renaissance philosophers, in postulating his ideas on the subject, referred to a text dating from antiquity. This text, which was initially attributed to Aristotle, was in fact written by Aristotle's pupils Theophrast. In the well-known Problema 31, we read the following, I cite, "Why is it that all men who have achieved eminence, whether it be in philosophy, politics, poetry, or the arts, show every sign of being melancholic?" End of quote. The ancients already had the conception that prominent men, heroes, and men who devoted themselves to intellectual pursuits were all melancholic men. Now, melancholy, which theology had condemned, was being presented in a positive light, a different way of looking at it that found substantiation in sources dating from antiquity. In the Renaissance, astrology played a vital role. Saturn was seen as a dangerous, but also as a positive planet. In his 3-volume work, De Vita Triplici, from the end of the 15th century, Ficino describes melancholy as being the ambivalent temperament of those who are born under Saturn. On the one hand, they are plagued with suffering. On the other hand, they were endowed with exceptional aptitudes. He describes melancholy as being a unique divine gift, identical to the poetic enthusiasm described by Plato. Only a melancholic person, he writes, is capable of creative enthusiasm. He combines two separate traditions of thought, that of Plato and that of Theophrast. In doing so, he marks the beginning of a discourse that was to hold sway well into the modern era, namely that which identifies melancholy with male genius. Albrecht Dürer's master engraving, Melancholia I, is dated 1514. For a long time, this copperplate engraving determined the evolution of what became a pictorial tradition. The amount of research literature devoted to this work is far too vast for me even to begin to list it here. But I would like to refer you at least to the seminal work by Klibansky, Panofsky, Saxl, which was re-edited in 1990, to the synoptic view provided by Schuster from 1975, and that by Büchsel from 2010, to the essay by Konrad Hoffmann, and finally to the study done by Hartmut Böhme. All these publications you find, of course, listed in the lecture's literature list. Depicted in the engraving is a winged female figure in a melancholy pose with her head supported by her hand. She is holding a pair of compasses in her right hand. The hand is resting on a closed book, which is lying in her lap. Her face veiled in shadow, she is gazing into the distance. Her head is crowned with a wreath of leaves, which are actually not laurel leaves, but leaves of watercress and water parsnips, two plants that were believed to be remedies for melancholy. She's sitting in front of an architectural structure that has no windows. The ladder leaning up against this building indicates that it extends upwards beyond the frame of the picture. A set of keys is attached to the winged figure's belt, and a purse is lying on the end of her dress. Scattered over the ground around her are all kinds of objects, some of which are craftsman's tools, including a hand plane, a saw, a straight edge, a pair of pliers, which is practically hidden underneath the dress. And there are also nails. There are geometrical objects, namely a sphere and a polyhedron. Lying in front of the polyhedron is a hammer. A crucible can be seen behind the polyhedron. A dog is sleeping at the woman's feet. Between the dog and the sphere are an inkwell and a quill holder. A putter is sitting on a mill wheel, scribbling something on a tablet. Set into the wall of the buildings is a 4x4 magic square, above which a bell is hanging, and next to the bell is an hourglass. A pair of scales is hanging on the side of the building. In the background, a seascape stretches into the distance. There is a rainbow forming a great arc cover over a comet, in front of which a bat is flying, bearing a scroll with the inscription Melancholia 1. We find few of the attributes traditionally associated with melancholy. There is a head supported by the hand, and the hand clenched into a fist. And there is a face in shadow. The keys and the purse symbolize power and wealth, the latter of which, although present in the picture, is ignored by the winged figure. The iconography can be explained neither by a reference to the images among the Planetenkinderbilder that relate to Saturn, nor by reference to the depictions of melancholy among the images corresponding to the temperaments. The engraving is truly a first. Dürer combines the image of melancholy with the allegory of geometry. Geometry, considered to be one of the liberal arts, was very closely connected to painting, sculpture, and architecture. Dürer saw in measurement and geometry the basis of art, measurement was essential for perspective, but the sphere also represents astronomy, considered at the time to be the supreme science. The tools in the picture stand for the practical application of geometry, as well as representing the necessary tools of the artist's craft. The sleeping dog is very often an attribute of man of learning. The dog in the engraving is nothing but skin and bones and should therefore be seen as an embodiment of actidia, of sloth. Significantly, the dog has been positioned just opposite the little Buddha. One might say that the childishly naive little creature can just go on scribbling as it pleases, completely untroubled. It is sitting on top of a mill wheel, which is perhaps a symbol for time that has come to an halt. Melancholy, the allegorical figure, is situated between the sleeping dog, in other words, actidia, and animal ignorance, and on the other hand, on the activeness of a little child. Melancholy's inactivity is not, however, languor. It is not apathy, but on the other hand, it is by no means carefree activity. Rather, it is concentrated cogitation. The Jupiter magic square was held to be a remedy against the nefarious influence of Saturn. The principle of the 4-to-4 magic square is that each row of 4 integers always adds up to 34. So 34 is the lifetime of Christ. The hourglass and the pair of scales are symbols for time and measurement. The fact that the 7-rung ladder, representing the several liberal arts, extends upwards beyond the frame of the picture can be interpreted as signifying that melancholy is aware of her lack of knowledge. As for the comet, the time were marked by a fear of comets. At the time of upheaval around 1500, countless apocalyptic scenarios had been conjured up, in particular the fear that a comet would destroy the Earth. An incursion of a comet that would cause a cataclysm similar to the biblical flood had been predicted for the year 1524. The rainbow from time immemorial was a symbol of consolation and hope in God. Discussion of the bat and the scroll has been very controversial. Panofsky makes a reference to the treatise by Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim entitled De Occulta Philosophia, a work, however, that had not yet been published at the time Dürer produced his engraving. According to Panofsky, Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia wasn't printed until 1533, but it had already been circulating in manuscript form as early as 1510. In De Occulta Philosophia, Agrippa distinguishes 3 levels of creative melancholy, with the lowest level, level number 1, corresponding to the imagination. This is a wistful melancholy of artists, melancholia imaginationis. Then comes level number 2, which corresponds to the contemplative melancholy of scholars, melancholia rationis. The third and last level, the highest, is melancholia mentis, the melancholy of the true theologian. According to Panofsky, Dürer is showing melancholy's genius at its lowest level, inactive, paralyzed, and dejected because of its intellectual powerlessness. However, it must also be said that Dürer makes a point of bringing references into the pictures that evoke, on the one hand, the possibility of acquiring knowledge through the sciences, and on the other hand, the theological dimension. According to Konrad Hoffmann, the bed bearing the scroll with the inscription Melancholia 1 represents negative melancholy, a melancholy that is flying out of the picture, as opposed to Melancholia number 2, that is the personification, which is a positive portrayal. Then again, there is the interpretation proposed by Gilo and Büchsel, according to which the so-called numeral 1 is not a numeral, but a letter, namely E, standing for the imperative form of the Latin verb ire, which means go. This would mean that the scroll should be understood as signifying melancholy, go away. What might argue in favor of this interpretation is the fact that bats, being nocturnal creatures, carry a negative connotation, and it's true that this bat appears to be flying out of the picture. Then there is interpretation put forth by Schuster, who sees here a numeral 1, and he identifies it with a basic numeral in mathematics. Opinions as to how the engraving should be understood differ considerably. In Panofsky's view, Melancholy is distraught over her lack of knowledge, an interpretation that is totally in line with Ficino and Agrippa von Nettesheim. Konrad Hoffmann shares this view and even takes it further, arguing from a point of view that is also theological. He stresses the significance of the rainbow, which God put in the sky after the great flood as a sign of his covenant with man. Melancholy realizes the earthly frailty of her genius. At the same time, there is this reference to God and his protection. Schuster's melancholy portrayed in a positive light, as a paragon of virtue. Büchsel, on the other hand, taking a purely theological standpoint, sees her as a very negative figure. Böhme points out that the relationship between signs and meanings, as it had been known from theology and philosophy, is no longer clearly legible here, which means that the modern age has truly dawned. In Böhme's view, Dürer is devising a new interpretation of Saturnian genius in strengths that had become alert and in the wide range of questions that are asked. A new form of dignity becomes visible. Böhme sees this new form of dignity consisting in the fact that, and I quote Böhme, man reflecting upon a world full of signs acquires an inner sense of himself as a subject with finite awareness, and knowing the limits that exist, he creates the possible. End of quote. Here I'd like to make a personal remark. Dealing with interpretations can be tricky. I do not presume to provide you with a correct interpretation. You see, it is very difficult. You can't imagine how many interpretations there exist about this. However, here, as is so often the case, I get the impression that art historians are determined to find a single, unequivocal solution. But as I see it, Dürer has managed, in one single print, to present all aspects of melancholy in all their complexity and ambiguity, both the positive aspects and the negative, both the theological and the humanistic. We see geometry, astronomy, the sciences, astrology, the skilled crafts and trades. But there is also a religious dimension. All of these are essential components of knowledge. But in the end, perhaps, the highest level of acquired knowledge is the realization of the limits of our knowledge. Scio mene scire, as the Latin phrase goes. In other words, I know that I do not know. Thinking, musing about all that, our knowledge makes possible, but also about the limits of our knowledge. This is melancholy. Critical awareness and pain go together. Dürer relates melancholy to knowledge and awareness. He relates it to the sciences, to religious belief and ethics, to work, to the universe, to the temperaments, to the notion of impermanence, and to the image the artist has of himself. When we really look at the print, we find ourselves doing what the figure in the print is doing. Gazing, reflecting, brooding, realizing, but also realizing that we do not understand everything. In any case, what Dürer has succeeded in doing is not only to create a complex allegory, a conceptual image, but also by means of his grave personification, this female figure resting her head on her hand, gazing strangely before her, the darkness also grave, as is the whole atmosphere of the picture. Dürer has managed to give aesthetic expression to the world of melancholy, and by the same token has made it something that the viewer can experience emotionally. I would like to touch on yet another totally different aspect of allegory, namely the fact that the allegorical figure here is female. With only few exceptions, allegories and personifications are consistently female. There's a reason for this. Portraying a figure as female ensures that it will be understood as an abstract allegory, a personification, and not as a concrete person. In the case at hand, if the central figure were a male, this male would be seen as representing a concrete man of letters, which, however, would be a bit difficult due to the wings. This is a consistent rule, and it cannot be explained as necessarily deriving from grammatical gender. The names of the arts, the names of the sciences, the word for victory, etc., in the languages that have grammatical genders, as in German, for instance, each of these words has one gender, but it can be masculine or feminine. But it happens that all the female allegories are female. And the interesting thing is that the figures find themselves representing areas of human activity from which women are excluded. The arts, the science, and so on. Dürer's print had an extraordinary influence, but no other artist ever achieved this form of complexity. This is not because any failure on the part of artists, rather it can be explained by the fact that the discourse regarding melancholy branched off in various directions, each of which is its own focus, such as melancholy as a prerequisite for artistic genius, melancholy as a phenomenon of the inner psyche, melancholy as an emotional state, melancholy as a form of madness, and melancholy as an illness. The differentiation of focus implied, however, a narrowing of scope. There was another attempt, this time in written form, to examine melancholy in all its aspects, namely Robert Burton's classic work, published in 1621, entitled The Anatomy of Melancholy, what it is, with all the kinds, causes, symptoms, prognostics, and several cures of it, in 3 partitions with their several sections, members and subsections, philosophically, medicinally, historically, opened and cut up. The book presents a synopsis of all the concepts of melancholy that had been known until then, from antiquity to the Middle Ages, and from the Middle Ages up to the early modern era. The work draws on theological, philosophical, medical, and other sources. The version of 1628, or later as you see it here, edition bears an elaborate frontispiece. Underneath the title is a portrait of Burton. To his left is Superstitiosus, with the signs of Jupiter, the Sun, and Mercury. Melancholy was often referred to as the illness of monks. To Burton's right is Maniacus, with the symbols for Mars and the Moon. Above him is Hypochondriacus, with the symbol for Saturn. Across from him is Innamorato, with the sign of Venus. And above the title is Democritus in the garden of the ancient town Abdera. The philosopher Democritus dissected animals in order to determine where the seat of melancholy was located in the body. When publishing his book, Robert Burton chose to use the pseudonym Democritus Junior, so he identified with Democritus. Partition 1 of the book is an attempt to define melancholy and identify its symptoms and causes. There's almost nothing that doesn't cause a person to become melancholy. The list is long. A person's predisposition or temperament, the stars, the bodily organs, parents, bad diet, bad air, too much occupation, ambition, narcissism, the thirst for fame, erudition, poverty, and want, loss, fear. And then, of course, there's a melancholy of maidens, the melancholy of widows, the melancholy of nuns, and so on. But above all, melancholy is caused by wars, bad governments, and oppression. In partition 2, cures are recommended, and these include medicines, medical herbs, improved diet, good air, diversion and entertainment, music, activity. A separate partition, number 3, is devoted to love melancholy. After offering every possible analysis, recommending every possible form of therapy for this particular kind of melancholy, Burton gives his ultimate bit of advice, and I quote, "The last and best cure of love melancholy is to let them have their desire." But let's come back to the fine arts. In his engraving, Dürer addresses the dilemma of his own existence as an artist situated between genius on the one hand and the suffering caused by his awareness of his own limitations on the other. In time, melancholy would come to be seen as a very sign of male artistic genius. Thus, Raphael, in his fresco The School of Athens, portrays Michelangelo as Heraclite. He is shown in a contemplative pose, with his head resting on his hand, gazing downwards in the process of writing one of his sonnets. Rembrandt did many self-portraits, perhaps as many as 80, portraits that differ greatly from one another and in which he shows himself wearing various styles of apparel, as if he were trying to find his own identity and define his new role as an artist in bourgeois Holland. He also portrayed himself as a melancholy person. He shows himself in his character without any allegorical accessories. The pose is not even the usual melancholy pose with the head resting on a hand. Here, exclusively by means of his treatment of the face, Rembrandt is trying to show melancholy as an inner psychological state. It is particularly the eyes in shadow that characterize him as a melancholy person. In his later self-portraits, which you see on the right, the melancholy aspect becomes only one among others, as it were. What Rembrandt is out to do is to show the complexity of the human psyche, which cannot be reduced to a single aspect. The Enlightenment of the 18th century tried to establish reason as the only means of arriving at truth. It viewed fantasy as being contrary to rational thought and, consequently, something that had to be suppressed. In a similar line of reasoning, melancholy was generally rejected, being considered a form of idleness and a delusional subjective state. However, what was being suppressed came back with all its strength in the individual inner world. And Goya, like no one before him, managed to capture this modern-aged experience of enduring the conflicting forces of objective aspiration and subjective reality, the conflicting forces of reason and irrationality. Goya's Capriccios, a series of 80 aquatint etchings published in 1799, are to be seen as a reverse side of the Enlightenment. The Spanish word capriccio, from Italian capriccio, can be translated as fancy or whim. In classical art theory, capriccios were considered a genre at the very bottom of the scale. In Goya's work, they find their status being upgraded. Here, the crazy capriccios do an excellent job of exposing the world's insanity. Insanity caused by power, corrupt nobility, the stupidity propagated by the church, lack of education, superstition. Goya's capriccios were a subjective words, and at the same time, unsparing social criticism. The person who is in the best position to expose the insanity is the artist. The artist who finds himself situated between reason and fantasy. In publicly announcing the publication of his Capriccios, Goya wrote in 1799, and I quote, "And even if imitating nature is alone a difficult task, and worthy of admiration when it is done well, respect is also due to the individual who, having completely turned his back on nature, has been obliged to exhibit forms and gestures that until now had existed only in the human mind, which is obscured and confused due to the lack of enlightenment or overheated by unrestrained passions. In his first preparatory drawing for Capriccio 43, which was originally intended as a title page, the artist portrays himself sitting next to his work desk, with his head lying on his folded arms, apparently sleeping, perhaps dreaming. The fact that it is he who is portrayed is attested by the caption to his second preparatory drawing for the work, El autor sonando, the author dreaming. So it's clear that what is meant is the artist. Rising up from his head are other heads, likeness of Goya done in pen strokes that seem to radiate. Some of these likenesses are contemplative, inquisitive, turned on their sides. Others have been grotesquely distorted beyond recognition. In the final etching, only the nocturnal creatures remain, the bats threateningly flying towards the artist, the owls and the cat. One of the owls, like all owls, both a spooky nocturnal creature and an animal that is associated with Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is handing the artist a drawing pencil. You see it totally at the left when you see. He links and looks with his eye wide open, seems to be keeping watch. El sueño de la razón produce monsters. The sleep of reason produces monsters. The inscription is as ambiguous as the rest of the etching. The purpose of inscriptions is usually to explain something. Here, however, the words are ambiguous because in Spanish, the word sueño can mean both sleep and dream. So the inscription can be understood as meaning either the sleep of reason produces monsters, or reason itself, when it dreams, produces monsters. Does enlightenment keep monsters at bay, or does it produce them? This ambiguity cannot be done away with. It was undoubtedly Goya himself who best explained the ambiguity when he wrote, and I quote, "Fantasy, abandoned by reason, produces impossible monsters. United with it, she, fantasy, is the mother of the arts and the origin of marvels." End of quote. In the picture, the light falls on the artist, on the area of his shoulders, and decidedly on his right hand, the hand that is going to draw. I find it instructive to compare Goya's etching with an engraving by Jean Duvet, his frontispiece to an apocalypse dated 1555. Here Duvet has portrayed himself rather than John. His engraving is very much in line with the tradition of Dürer. In contrast to Goya's Capriccio, here we see a devil and an angel competing with each other to whisper in the author's ear what each has to say. In Duvet's engraving, we still see sinister demons and heavenly angels, all of which are exterior beings, which means that Duvet still adheres to the theological tradition. Sorry. By contrast with Goya, we have to do with ambiguous nocturnal creatures that seem to emanate from the inner self, products of the imagination. In Romanticism, the melancholy artistic genius is idolized. Melancholy and despair are seen as true signs of the artist. Eugène Delacroix portrays Michelangelo as a melancholy artist sitting in his atelier, inactive, in a moment of pure contemplation, resting his head on his fisted hand, flanked by two unfinished works, Moses and the Medici Madonna. His work tool has negligently been left lying on the floor. The artist himself is in a creative crisis. With his portrayal of Michelangelo, Delacroix is alluding to his own crisis and despair as an artist. Caspar David Friedrich portrays himself as melancholic in his self-portrait, dated 1802. Supporting his head with his right hand, which is also holding his drawing pencil, he is sitting with his left hand resting on the sheet of paper that is lying in front of him. He is not looking at the sheet of paper, nor is he looking out of the window in front of which he is sitting. His eyes are fixed on nothing in particular. They are just gazing vaguely into the distance, as if he were looking into himself, into his inner self, the source of his creativity. His open collar, disorderly scarf, and disheveled hair all accentuate the private, totally unimposing character of the scene. Here we have an example of melancholy seen as a prerequisite for the creative process. In 1919, Paul Klee did many drawings in which he broke artistic melancholy down into its constituent parts, as it were. Pondering artist, feeling artist, absorption. In absorption, the eyes are closed in meditative concentration. For his creativity, the artist draws not on his surroundings, but solely on his inner self, on his ingenuity. With its strict frontality, absolute symmetry, and abstraction, absorption is reminiscent of the vera icon, the divine image associated with the wheel of Veronica. Is melancholy art is to be seen here as God, the creator? Melancholy seen as a condition for artistic genius was only one of the perceived forms of melancholy. We have already mentioned the assumption that only man could possess genius. Female melancholy was given a moral character. It was mostly associated with death and found expression in the vanitas genre. An example is a painting by the Italian artist Domenico Fetti. The awareness of one's own transience, of the inevitability of death, brings on melancholy. Mary Magdalene, such as a painting painted by Hendrik Terboven, here melancholy is viewed as a consequence of one's awareness of a badly lived life, a life that one regrets but can no longer change. Woman is portrayed as penitent, melancholy as penitence. Melancholy is also seen as being primarily a form of depression, a fragile mental state. There are few biblical themes that are directly connected with the notion of melancholy. One of those few, however, is David playing the harp before Saul. After David's victory over Goliath, King Saul takes him into his palace and gives him his daughter Michal as a bride. Saul is depressed. David is much more popular among the people than he, their king. Saul's jealousy grows, and the form of paranoia takes hold of him. Wanting to relieve Saul's depression, David plays his harp for him. You remember that playing music is a very good remedy for melancholy. Examples showing David playing his harp for Saul, you have many manuscripts showing this. One day, however, Saul is overcome by his anger against David and hurls his spear at him, but the spear misses him. As early as an engraving by Lucas van Leyden, one of Rembrandt's most important predecessors, and like Rembrandt, native of Leiden, we can see that the artist is attempting to depict Saul's mental state. In an early work by Rembrandt, Saul's melancholy is portrayed as an inner, purely psychological state. This can be seen in details such as Saul's hand clinching to the arm of his chair, as if he is holding himself back, his knitted eyebrows, his pinched lips, his entire poise, and of course the eerie lighting. In contrast to all this, David, who can just barely be seen, is completely absorbed in his playing. An allegorical depiction, such as the one we saw by Dürer, would be unthinkable in the case of Rembrandt. With Rembrandt, melancholy is no longer embedded in an all-embracing cosmological and religious context. Rather, it is seen as a purely psychological process. I show you another example in this drawing. Or you see this late painting, it's not sure whether it's Rembrandt or a pupil. Saul appears to be wiping a tear from his eye. Here again, what we see depicted is not Saul hurling his spear at David, nor his struggle to keep his composure, but rather the soothing effect of musing, relieving Saul's emotional tension. This profound effect that music can have can already be seen in a motif in the Stuttgart Psalter, which dates from the 9th century. Here you see an illustration to Psalm 42. The psalmist sings, "Why do you grieve, O my soul? Why are you so restless within me? Put your hope in God." The anima, our soul, is sitting on top of a hill in a melancholy pose, listening to the sounds of the music. The soul has been externalized, which in the Middle Ages was a form of allegorization. This form of representation, however, would not have been thinkable in antiquity. no more than it would be in modern times. But in Christian medieval thought, the soul could be conceived of as separating itself from the body. For example, after death, of course, the soul is separates from the body. Alongside Lucas van Leyden, Gertrude Sontinians also had to do with forming Rembrandt's conception. Gerken's John the Baptist in the Wilderness, dating from the 15th century, was certainly one of the first portrayals of a person overcome by melancholy. You see John sitting, it's not really a desert, it's a wonderful landscape, but in this melancholy gesture, and look at his feet, you know, one foot over the other. For comparison, one can look at how various Italian artists have approached the scene. In the Baroque period, for example, dramatic action, the body expresses what is taking place in the mind. So it's a completely different kind of representation as in the North. Sometimes animals can be substitutes for an expression of the melancholy state of mind, such as in the case of the little dog in Velázquez's portrait of Prince Philip Prospero, the deathly ill young heir to the Spanish throne. So you see the boy, very representative because he had to be a representative, but he is very ill and he died shortly after this. And the expression of melancholy is put into the gesture, in the face of this little dog. Much later, Goya went even further by portraying a dog alone, lost, appearing to sink into nothingness. In the Romantic period, melancholy is a frequently treated theme, being seen not only as characteristic of artistic genius, but also as a general state of being. In Germany, in particular, this interest in the subject has to do with the aborted bourgeois revolution, political repression, deluded hopes, a feeling of helplessness, what Leibniz refers to as Handlungshemmung, inhibition of action, causes a basic feeling of melancholy to emerge among the bourgeoisie. Like no other artist, Caspar David Friedrich was able to give this mental state pictorial expression. The Monk by the Sea, one of the most famous paintings. The individual withdraws from society to be totally alone with nature. The basic feeling of melancholy is now projected onto nature. What is, of course, very impressive here is that you see the painting before the restoration. That was a great picture that evoked feelings of utter hopelessness. And then after the restoration, admittedly, it still remained a melancholy picture, but at the same time, one that offers hope. Here you can see, when I saw this picture after restoration, I couldn't believe it because it has changed completely. Caspar David Friedrich also did paintings in which melancholy was visually expressed, no longer by means of human individuals, but by nature alone. Nature as a mirror of human existence. So the Sea of Ice, also called the Wreck of Hope, painted between 1822 and 24. In other words, a relatively late work. The painting shows an Arctic landscape with enormous chunks of ice, floes that have piled up. In the middle ground on the right are the remains of a wrecked ship. In the background, like a Fata Morgana, we see a visual echo of the iceberg. The piled up slabs of ice bring tombstones to mind. Something abstract about them gives them a symbolic dimension. What inspired Friedrich to paint, has to convey, goes much deeper than that. Ships as metaphors for life or for the state have a long tradition, as do shipwrecks as symbols of failure. The Sea of Ice is basically a history painting that has been transposed into a picture of nature, an allegorical landscape, something that could not have been said or painted in any other way. A picture about failure, the violent force of nature, death. On the social level, however, a picture about the situation following the efforts at restoring the old order in Europe during the age of Metternich, a situation characterized by stagnation, hopelessness, extreme coldness, the perception that things had become one great heap of ruins. In short, melancholy. As you can see, melancholy can be portrayed in very different ways. Allegorically, as in the case of Dürer, or by means of bodily expression, including facial expression, or transformed as non-human creature, or projected onto nature. These are all different modes of representation, and each one, of course, offers a different interpretation of melancholy. But let's take a step backwards again, back to the time around 1800. At the time of the Enlightenment, the ways of viewing and discussing melancholy diverge. Rejected by many philosophers of the Enlightenment, melancholy is seen in a positive light by Kant. In his view, the melancholic person is able to experience the sublime. Around 1800, however, a new approach to the phenomenon of melancholy emerges. Melancholy begins to be viewed primarily as a medical concern. This period in history sees the emergence of psychiatry, the so-called insane, which included persons suffering from serious cases of melancholy or cases of manic illness, were now put in special clinics, namely psychiatric clinics. Before that, it was common practice to put them in prisons with criminals. Philippe Pinel, one of the most significant French psychiatrists, literally unchained the inmates of mental asylums. Pinel's student, Jean-Étienne Dominique Esquirol, also had a student, Etienne Jean Georget, and it was to this Dr. Georget that the painter Géricault made a gift of numerous portraits of mental patients of the clinic in which Georget worked. 5 of these portraits have survived. The labels to these portraits were added later and should therefore be viewed with skepticism. Georget wrote a book on insanity, De la Folie, in which he stresses, among other things, the importance of seeing in insanity what generally belongs to the human condition. Just as there are various ways that one can view the beginnings of this psychiatric approach to things, there are various ways to view these portraits. One can see them as an effort to take the mentally ill seriously. After all, doing a portrait means that the subject of the portrait is being taken seriously. On the other hand, one might ask whether this isn't perhaps an attempt to equate a psychic condition with an outward appearance, as if we are to conclude that whoever looks like this is insane, that is, that insanity is something that is reflected in the face. I'm personally inclined to prefer the first interpretation because I find that in this portrait, Géricault has not demonized his subjects. He has blurred the boundary between what is called normal and what is called abnormal. When we look at these portraits, we can find something of ourselves. It would go far beyond the scope of this lecture for me to take you through the history of psychiatry and then psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. I would only like to remark that this predominantly medical view of the phenomenon that concerns us here still persists, and that this way of seeing things can be judged in more ways than one. And above all, we still know very little about how the physics and the psyche interrelate. Are certain disorders organically conditioned? Are they genetically programmed, or do they have psychological causes? Perhaps some rooted in early childhood experiences. Are those disorders determined by social conditions? I find it enlightening to realize how broad the scope of the discourse surrounding melancholy had become, and how nuanced the discourse had become, but how narrow it seems to have become today. It has been narrowed down to seeing melancholy as a form of depression, an illness that should be therapeutically treated with medication. I certainly do not deny the existence of severe forms of depression for which psychotropic drugs are perhaps the only solution. But maybe we should also accept that melancholy simply belongs to the human condition, that it is part of human existence. Maybe we should also try to ask in each case what the causes might be, the private and individual causes, but also the social causes. And maybe we should try to keep the age-old therapeutic advice in mind, keep active.